Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey there, who there, hey there. Welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast, and what up? I'm glad you made it back for this episode of the podcast as we continue our journey through this most recent series that we've been working through, Understanding Your Story. And if you've been with me, you know that I'm working my way through 16 principles on how to understand the story of your life. And the reason we're interested in doing this is because I believe it's very necessary in order to achieve and experience the true healing and redemption that God has intended for us. That healing has something to do with the stories of our life. And this concept of story is at the epicenter of what God wants to do. And as you know, we are currently on Principle 14 of the 16 principles. Principle 1 through 10 were kind of the bad news about what's gone wrong in our stories, how pain and hurt and brokenness and sin and dysfunction and disorientation has come into our lives through the vehicle of our stories. We all have stories, and stories hold power. And this power in our stories is often like poison. And these stories follow us through our lives, and stories layer themselves in our lives and create themes. And that we all have sexual stories. And for many of us, sex represents the deepest pain and shame of our life, and that our sexual self is rooted in the stories of our life. That's all kind of the bad news. Then we come to Principle 11, which starts the good news because it brings God into the equation. Principle 11 taught us that God wants to bring His healing to the most hurtful and painful stories of our life. Principle 12, to experience God's healing in your sexual self will involve you entering a working cooperation with God. Principle 13, to experience God's healing in your heart and life will involve you letting God into the most hurtful and painful stories of your life. And that brings us to Principle 14, which we began in our last episode, 12 suggestions on letting God into the stories of your life. And we covered the first 4 of those 12 principles. Number 1, we must identify the most painful and shameful stories of our lives. We must face the most painful and shameful stories of our life. Number 3, you must enter the most painful and shameful stories of your life. Number 4, you must explore the most painful and shameful stories of your life. And that brings us to Principle 5, where we continue today, which is this: you must begin to understand the most painful and shameful stories of your life. And in the shadow of the museum metaphor that I introduced in our last episode, isn't that in a sense exactly what you're seeking to do when you go into a museum? You're going into that museum so you can understand something that you've never understood before. For example, if you go to the Pearl Harbor Museum, you want to learn about Pearl Harbor. What happened? How did it happen? When did it happen? All these things that we want to learn and understand about Pearl Harbor. So you go to the museum so you can enter it and explore it and understand some things that happen. If you go to the 9/11 Museum in New York City, we want to understand some things about what happened on 9/11. So in a sense, you're kind of going back in time to actually visit and remember what happened historically on that particular day or during that particular time, so you can understand the events of the day and how it happened and why it happened and what were the results of it happening and who did it affect and how did it affect them and so forth and so on. In a sense, it's kind of like connecting the dots. It's like putting the pieces of a puzzle together so you can begin to see and understand and comprehend the full import of how this event or situation or story really impacted and affected your life. And we therefore might ask a question like this: what is it exactly that we need to understand about the most painful and shameful stories of our lives? And I'd suggest there's probably a whole lot for us to begin to understand about these places and stories of our lives. For example, I've referenced the story of my wife's rape. When she went back and did her therapeutic work, if she was to go into the museum of Sherry's rape, do you think there would be things that she needs to understand about that? Of course, there would be many things that she could begin to understand that would probably really help her with that particular story of her life. Because the fact is that our lives have been profoundly impacted and influenced by these things that happen to us in the context of certain stories, probably in far greater ways than we've ever really understood before. So, for example, we might want to begin to understand how what happened affected me. I might want to understand how what happened hurt me, how what happened shaped me, how it began to influence me, how I responded to it. I might want to understand, what did I do with it? How did it make me feel? I might want to understand, how did it affect my viewpoint of myself? How did it affect my viewpoint of other people? How did it affect my viewpoint of the world? How did it affect my viewpoint of God? How did it affect my viewpoint of relationships? How did it affect my viewpoint of sex? How did it affect my relationship with my own femininity, if I'm a woman, or masculinity, if I'm a man? How did it affect my ability to trust others? How did it affect my heart? How did it affect my viewpoint of men or of women? What lessons did the situation teach me, even though I probably didn't even realize I was learning lessons at the time? What lessons or convictions were embedded in me because of what happened? I might want to understand, how did what happened to me begin to follow me through life? How did it affect the way I was thinking? How did it affect the decisions and choices that I would make for years to come? How did it affect the kind of people that I would hang around with? How did it affect my ability to maintain proper boundaries in my relationships? How did it affect the way I would allow people to speak to me? How did it affect the way I would allow people to treat me? And on it goes. So as you can see, chances are very good that the most painful and shameful stories of our lives have impacted us and affected us in far greater ways than maybe we've ever understood before. And because of this, I have no doubt that there's going to be a lot for us to figure out and to comprehend and to understand as we begin to dig into our own stories and begin to connect the dots and begin to understand ourselves better than we ever have before. And before we move away from this particular point, that we need to understand the most painful and shameful stories of our lives, there's at least one other observation I'd like to share with you concerning this concept of understanding your stories. And really, it's kind of a disclaimer, and the disclaimer is this: I'm not suggesting here that we'll always be able to understand the things that have happened to us in our lives, because the fact is, there's a whole lot about life and a whole lot about this world and a whole lot about the things that have happened to us that we will probably never be able to understand. Or said another way, sometimes life and the world and people and situations and the things that happen simply do not make sense, and they cannot be understood. And the reality is that if you insist on understanding something that can't be understood, it's essentially an exercise in futility, and you'll probably drive yourself crazy. There's a beautiful scripture that you probably already know, Proverbs 3, verse 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge God, and He will direct your path. So the fact is that some things in life can never be understood, and some things in life will never make sense and never be understood. So I think it's important to realize and acknowledge that as we journey back into the stories of our lives and we're seeking to understand our stories and seeking to understand how certain things have affected and shaped and harmed our lives, that we do so with a heart to learn as much as we can learn and to understand as much as we can understand and to connect the dots to the best of our ability and to seek God's healing and wisdom in our hearts and lives, but at the same time realizing that there may be certain things that we'll never be able to understand on this side of heaven, no matter how hard we try. And that brings us to Principle 6 of the 12 suggestions on letting God into your stories. And Principle 6 is this: you must begin to talk about the most painful and shameful stories of your life. And the operative word there is talk about. You see, as we move forward in this process, your stories are no longer hidden from you. They're no longer hiding in the darkness because you're now bringing them out into the light. You're no longer trying to deny they exist. You're no longer trying to avoid them or elude them or escape them. You're not doing what you did with the refrigerator, facing away from it, trying to deny that it exists, because you've turned toward it, you've identified it, you've faced it, you're entering it, you're exploring it, you're beginning to understand it, and that means that you're going to have to start talking about it. And this is probably something that you've maybe never done before, talking about the most painful and shameful stories of your life. And let me say that in short, I believe this is going to be a profoundly significant and necessary stepping stone on your healing journey. Your ability to talk about what happened to you, and your ability to talk about what they did to you, and your ability to talk about how it affected you, and what you yourself did, and how it made you feel, and how it gained power in your soul, and how it followed you into your life, and how it produced shame in you, and how you learn to manage your shame, and on and on and on it goes. Or said another way, your ability to talk about all these things will be profoundly important to your healing journey. Or here's another way to say it: talk about it and find healing, or don't talk about it and don't find healing. And I think a really good example of this principle that I'm thinking of is taken from a movie that I really like that's entitled Short Term 12. So I'm going to play a video clip for you here, only through my words. Instead of watching the video, you're going to have to listen to it. But this movie, Short Term 12, it's a movie about a short-term group house for troubled teenagers. And the main character is a woman named Grace, who works as a supervisor at this house for troubled teenagers. And as the story unfolds, we learn that Grace herself was sexually abused by her father when she was growing up. But she's never talked about what happened to her, and she's been very careful to avoid that part of her own story. Denying it, suppressing it, minimizing it, ignoring it, pretending like it never happened, or said another way, in the previously mentioned metaphor, she's been facing away from the refrigerator, keeping it behind her back, out of sight. That is, until one day a young, troubled teenager comes to the house, a little girl named Jaden. And as the story continues to unfold, Grace eventually suspects that Jaden is being sexually abused by her father, and that's why she's such a troubled young lady. But unfortunately, just like Grace has always done, Jaden is dealing with her problem by not dealing with her problem, and Jaden is therefore refusing to talk about it and is trying to deny what's really happening in her life. As Grace, therefore, is working with Jaden, trying to get her to admit the truth and to talk about it, it brings her face to face with her own story, because she's trying to get Jaden to do something that she herself has never done. And then, in this very powerful scene, Grace admits to Jaden that she was also sexually abused by her father, and in a mystery, the two of them are then able to do together what they were each unable to do by themselves. It's as if they enter into this alliance with each other. And it's really awesome because they both finally become willing to admit the truth about what really happened to them, and they both become willing to begin talking about it. And then, toward the end of the movie, there's another poignant scene where we see Grace in a counseling session with her therapist. And although it's still an incredibly hard thing to do, she's beginning to talk about what her father did to her. And in this scene, the therapist says to Grace, "Now, Grace, I know this is really, really hard, but this is our third session together, and you really haven't talked about this very much. So do you think that we could try to talk about you and your dad today?" And Grace slowly affirms this and nods her head and says, "Yes, I'll try to talk about it." And at this point, if this wasn't just a podcast with people listening to me right now, and there was like a group of us sitting together in a circle discussing this principle, I think a good discussion question would be something like this. Why do you think it's so important and necessary and therapeutic for a person to talk about what happened to them? How would you answer that question? Or said another way, why do you think it was so important for Grace and Jaden to both begin talking about what happened to them? How would you answer that question? In my personal situation, my wife was over 30 years old when she finally made it to counseling and had the opportunity to finally start talking about what happened to her when she was raped when she was 13 years old. So how would you answer this question? Why do you think it was so important for Sherry, after 20 years, to finally talk about her rape? I myself was about 35 years old when I finally, for the first time in my life, began to talk about finding my dad's pornography when I was 10 years old and being sexually abused by two older women during my adolescence, and talking about what happened when my first pastor was having sex with my girlfriend when I was 16 years old, and talking about the most shameful stories of my life, including losing my ministry when I was a young pastor by becoming sexually involved with several members of the church, and becoming sexually involved in an affair with my best friend's wife. See, I had never talked about these things, guys. And let me just say, in conclusion of this particular principle, that I have no doubt whatsoever that coming to the place where you can finally begin to talk about the most painful and shameful stories of your life is profoundly important and significant and necessary. It's a stepping stone on your healing journey. And by the way, when we acknowledge the necessity of talking about these things, it doesn't mean that you have to go around and blab the most personal things about your life to everybody and anybody, but it does mean that you have to find at least one trusted person, maybe a counselor or a pastor or a mentor or a sponsor or a friend, that you can be absolutely honest and transparent with as you bring the most painful and shameful stories of your life out of the darkness and into the light. And before we move into our next principle, you guys, just in the way a quick review, we've discovered, remember, we're going through 12 suggestions on how to let God into the stories of your life. We must identify these stories. We must face these stories. We must enter these stories. We must explore these stories. We must understand these stories. We must begin to talk about these stories. And that brings us to our next principle, principle number 7, which is this: you must allow yourself to feel the most painful stories of your life. And the operative word here, guys, is feel. And you guys, I really believe that this is an incredibly important principle. And there's so much that can be said about it that we could really do a complete series of podcasts on just this issue of learning to truly feel the pain that lives in the stories of our life. And by the way, maybe at some point in the future, I'll try to do that series of episodes. But in the meantime, for our purpose here at this time, I'm going to share with you just a few basic ideas in the attempt to convey to you why I think this concept of feeling your pain is so important to the healing journey. And I'll do so by presenting what I believe are a couple very basic principles related to this. And the first one is what I would call detachment of heart. And I believe that this is a concept that virtually every human being intuitively learns at a very young age, detachment of heart. Or said another way, it doesn't take long for even children in this broken world to begin to figure out that this world can be a very painful place to live, and they therefore intuitively learn that life will be safer if I do not feel. And therefore, what most people do, and I would advocate that what most children do, is that they learn to detach from their own heart even when they don't realize that that's what they're doing. Because you see, if it's my heart that causes me to feel the deepest pain on the inside of me, then in a sense, my heart is kind of like my enemy, because it's my heart that causes me to hurt. So people therefore intuitively, without even cognitively realizing that they're doing so, learn to detach from their own heart so they feel less, and their life in this world will therefore be safer. That's what they think. And in the way of metaphor, I'm seeing two different pictures right now to illustrate this concept. The first one is this. Just picture yourself and your heart together on the same side of a big wall. And the problem with this picture is that since your heart is present to you, your heart is within your reach. You're close to your heart. You can actually feel what your heart feels. And it's this very dynamic that can be so scary to us because living in a fallen world often provokes feelings and hurts and disappointments that can be very painful. My heart hurts. So what many of us pretty quickly figure out is that life will be safer if I live on one side of the wall and I put my heart on the other side of the wall. And in that way, I'll be protected from my very own heart, and I'll therefore feel less, and life will therefore be safer. Or said another way, what I need to do is detach from my own heart. Or say it any other way you want to say it. You put your heart on the other side of the wall. Or we might say, you lock your heart up in a giant vault and you close the doors. Or you put your heart in a freezer and you lock the lid and you let your heart get frozen. That way it won't feel. Or you dig a really deep hole in the ground and you bury your heart down in the hole and then you cover it up with the dirt. Or you put your heart on a rocket ship and shoot it up to the moon. That way there's so much distance between you and your heart that you won't feel the pain. But whatever you do, put a barrier between you and your heart, or put distance between you and your heart, and get your heart the heck away from you, as far away from you as you can get it, because the goal is to basically put your heart way over there someplace, and for you to live your life way over here someplace, not even close to your own heart, because then you will feel less, and life in a broken world will seem safer. And the second metaphor I'm thinking of is the metaphor of a callus. So just imagine a really tough construction kind of a guy, maybe a bricklayer, a carpenter, a ditch digger, because he uses his hands so aggressively in his work. What happens over a period of time, his hands for real literally begin to get calluses on them. They callus over. And what's the purpose of those calluses? And obviously the purpose is to prevent your hands from feeling too much pain. As if your body had a voice, it's kind of like your body is saying to your hands, hey dude, this work that you're doing is really rough and tough, and it kind of hurts, and my skin keeps getting scratched and pinched and poked and pushed and cut, and it doesn't feel good, and in fact it even hurts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to protect our hands from feeling this pain. So I'm going to go ahead and form these calluses on our hands. I'm going to cover our hands with this thick, coarse, tough skin that doesn't have any nerve endings in it, and that way we won't be able to feel the hurt and the pain that we keep exposing ourselves to while we're doing this work, so that if I get poked or scratched or pinched or cut, it won't hurt as much. So the very purpose of the calluses is to protect you from feeling pain. And the point is this, you guys. I'd advocate that whether we realize it or not, this is exactly what so many people do, but instead of allowing those calluses to form on our hands to protect us from pain, we actually allow calluses to form on our hearts in order to keep us from feeling pain. And by the way, isn't it interesting to note that the Bible actually describes this very process and actually presents this same dynamic in many different ways? Because the Bible says that, among other things, people can harden their heart, darken their heart, turn their heart to stone, deaden their heart, and callous their heart. And here's just a couple examples. Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 26. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. Mark chapter 8, verse 17, the words of Jesus himself. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Have your hearts become hardened?" And Acts 28, verse 27, for this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. So we see, guys, that the tendency of human beings in a fallen world is to detach from their own heart, or to callous their heart, or to harden their heart so they don't feel their feelings. And with all that being said, let me just remind you for a moment of the principle that we're discussing here, because we've learned that not only should we identify the most painful and shameful stories of our lives, we identify them, but then we face them, we enter them, we explore them, we understand them, we begin to talk about them, but we should also allow ourselves to feel the most painful and shameful stories of our lives. But how are we going to feel the most painful and shameful stories of our lives if we've hardened our hearts, or if we've calloused our hearts, or if we put a big wall between us and our heart, or if we've locked our heart in a vault and closed the doors, or if we put our heart on a rocket ship and shot it to the moon? Then how are we going to feel our heart? Because we've detached from our heart. So you see, we won't be able to feel the most painful and shameful stories of our life if we can't feel our own heart. And because of this, I'd advocate that a very necessary and strategic stepping stone toward becoming a healthier person is going to involve the concept of bringing your heart back home to yourself. I love that concept, the concept of bringing your heart back home, which is incredibly important because it's going to make you a more whole and complete person. It's going to profoundly affect your ability to be truly present in your relationships, including your relationship with God, your relationship with other people, and your relationship with yourself. You know why? Because to be in successful relationship, God intends it to be heart to heart. I'm in a relationship in my heart with God, in a relationship in my heart with my wife, with my children. God intends our hearts to be the vehicle of effective relationship. So if I'm detached from my heart, how am I going to have an authentic, successful relationship with God? How am I going to have an effective, successful relationship with my wife or my children, or even with myself, with other people, with my friends, if I'm detached from my heart? So bringing your heart back home to yourself is incredibly important, because bringing your heart back home will enable you to begin to feel your feelings. And here's another way that I might say it, guys. If we intend to be a healthier person and we're interested in the ability to feel the most painful and shameful stories of our lives, then what you're going to have to figure out is how to knock down the wall between you and your heart, or how to unlock the doors and take your heart out of the vault, or how to bring your heart back from the moon so you can begin to live present to your own heart again. Or said another way, you're going to have to figure out what it means to bring your heart back home to yourself. And I want to share one other important observation before we move away from this principle, you guys, which is this. And I think that this is incredibly important, especially in view of this principle 14 that we're in the middle of, 12 suggestions on letting God into the stories of your life. Because I would suggest that there's a significant and important distinction between looking at the stories of your life and entering your stories and processing your stories. There's a big difference between doing this through your heart versus through your head. And let me just say that I believe that there's this dangerous tendency, especially in the West and especially in the American church, to lean toward experiencing our spirituality and our relationship with God primarily through our head rather than our heart. In other words, cognition, information, the transference of information, it's all from the neck up. So much of the preaching and teaching that we experience, I would advocate, is this massive and never-ending download of head knowledge, information, cognition about Christianity and about spirituality and about God. So we learn things like this: 5 principles about better stewardship, or 7 principles on how to be a better dad, or 10 principles of successful marriage, or 4 principles on how to be a more effective witness for Christ. And typically the things we learn are all very good information and knowledge. It's based on the truth, and it's all very helpful. But all I'm saying is that if we aren't careful, before long our Christian experience ends up being primarily cognitive in nature, or primarily information and teaching. Or said another way, we're trying to relate to God primarily through our head, from the neck up, instead of through our heart, from the neck down. And guess what, you guys? If God could choose, which one do you think he would choose? Say, Tony, I want you to relate to me through your head or through your heart. I'm telling you guys, the heart is profoundly significant in our relationship with God, and it's intended to be a heart-to-heart thing. I'm not saying that information is bad. Of course it is. We need to know the truth and be established in the truth. But our heart needs to be aggressively engaged in our faith. And that means my heart must be present to me, which means I've got to bring my heart home. And in the way of example, I might advocate that this is the important distinction between singing songs in church versus worshiping God in church. You see, one is primarily from the head. If I'm just singing songs, I'm singing words that are coming from my head and my vocal cords. But if I'm worshiping God, I'm singing from my heart. You see, the distinction is the involvement of my heart in the equation. And I have no doubt that God is far more interested in me worshiping Him than me just singing songs to Him. And in much the same way, the point I'm getting to, guys, is this, that I believe that as we seek to let God into the stories of our life, for it to be a truly healing and redemptive experience in our heart and soul, we have to face and process the most painful and shameful stories of our lives primarily through our heart, not just our head. We need to visit our stories with God through our heart, not just cognitively in our head. Oh yeah, that happened. That information. My mom died when I was 8. Oh yeah, my sister was killed in the car accident when I was 9. Oh yeah, my dad left our family when I was 10. Information. See, if you're just visiting your stories cognitively, you are not going to experience the healing that God intends for your heart and soul. We're going to have to engage our heart. We're going to have to, like God invited Mac to the shack, God wants us to bring our heart with us to this meeting, not just our head. Or said another way, it isn't just a cognitive journey that we're taking, it's an emotional journey. And it's not just a journey that we take in our head, it's a journey we take in our heart. And that's why it's going to be so important for us to bring our heart back home and to learn to live present to our own heart, even if it means that I'm going to have to start feeling feelings that I don't necessarily like to feel. Because guess what? If you're living present to your heart, you're going to be a whole human being, and you might feel painful feelings, but you're going to be alive, and you're going to be living the way God intended for you to live. Because the fact is, it's the journey of my heart that's going to lead to the deepest healing and redemption of my life and soul. And with that being said, you guys, I see from my clock that I'm way over time, but I really wanted to try to finish Principle 7, you must feel the most painful and shameful stories of your life, because I think it's an incredibly important principle, and I didn't want to interrupt it. So thank you for being with me for this episode of the Power of Purity podcast. I hope it's been a blessing. I hope it's informative. I hope it's helpful. I hope it's encouraging you. I pray that it's inspiring hope in you for your own healing journey. I pray it's helping you understand yourself better than you've ever understood yourself before. So I urge you forward. Let's keep moving forward as we seek God's healing and redemption, and as we seek to be the men that God is calling us to be, as we seek to close the gap between the men that we've been and the men that we're becoming. Praise be to God. Thanks for being here, you guys. God bless you, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Have an awesome day.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.